I spent 88 years believing happiness came from external circumstances before learning it's actually a daily practice. And after 43 years of marriage to Margaret, I discovered that some loves are so complete they don't need replacing. Choosing not to remarry wasn't about being stuck in grief, but about recognizing I'd already had my great love and that was enough. The only tragedy in life is living according to others' expectations rather than trusting yourself to know what you actually need. Because genuine contentment comes from being fully present to what you have instead of constantly waiting for circumstances to change. Love doesn't require physical presence to remain real. And the greatest act of courage is choosing authentically even when your path doesn't match what society expects. Because wholeness can exist without a partner.
I never believed that hospitals could be places of profound revelation until the night of November 12, 2024. That was the evening I met a man who would fundamentally alter everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and the courage it takes to honor what matters most. What he told me in those hours in a waiting room would challenge me, move me, and ultimately lead me here, to you, sharing a truth so quietly powerful that most people spend their entire lives never quite grasping it. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I witnessed, what I learned, and what I'm about to share with you. Because the old man was right about one thing. Once you understand what real love requires of us, you carry the weight of that knowledge forever. And sometimes, the most generous thing you can do is pass that weight to someone else who's ready to bear it. This is that story. It was one of those cold autumn evenings when the air itself seems to hold its breath. I had been sitting in the waiting hall of Mercy General Hospital for almost 2 hours, not really thinking about anything in particular, just existing in that strange liminal space hospitals create, where time moves differently and strangers become witnesses to each other's quiet anxieties. I was there for my sister, Emma, who was undergoing what her doctor had assured us was a routine gallbladder procedure. Nothing to worry about, they'd said, but someone needed to drive her home afterward, and I'd volunteered. So there I sat, surrounded by the familiar hospital symphony, the distant beeping of monitors, hushed conversations between nurses at their stations, the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly surreal quality. The waiting area was moderately full. A young couple sat across from me, the woman's pregnant belly prominent under her oversized sweater, both of them holding hands with the nervous intensity of first-time parents. An elderly woman knitted in the corner, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm that was oddly comforting. A middle-aged man in a business suit typed furiously on his laptop, as if work could distract him from whatever news he was waiting to receive. And then there was the old man. I'm not sure what drew my attention to him initially. Maybe it was his stillness. In a room full of fidgeting, phone-checking, magazine-flipping people, he sat with complete composure, hands folded in his lap, back straight despite what I estimated to be his mid to late 70s. He wore pressed gray slacks, a navy cardigan over a white button-down shirt, and brown leather shoes that had been recently polished. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his face, lined with the intricate map of a long life, held an expression of peaceful contemplation. But what truly caught my attention, what held it, was the wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth by what must have been decades of wear, and I watched as his right hand moved to it periodically, turning it gently with his thumb in a gesture that seemed completely unconscious. The movement was tender, almost reverent, like touching a talisman or saying a silent prayer. I'm what you might call a collector of human stories. Not professionally, I work in insurance, of all things, but instinctively. I've always been drawn to people who carry something in their silence, who have lived through experiences that marked them in ways visible only to those who know how to look. And this old man was clearly carrying something significant. I observed him for perhaps 20 minutes, watching the pattern repeat, perfect stillness for a few minutes, then that gentle touch to the ring, the brief closing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible nod to himself, and then stillness again. It was like watching someone engaged in a private ritual, a conversation with memory. The old man must have felt my attention because suddenly he turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were a striking pale blue, clear and sharp despite his age, and there was something in them, not annoyance at being observed, but a kind of knowing recognition, as if he understood exactly what I'd been doing. "It's the ring, isn't it?" he said, his voice surprisingly strong and warm. "People always notice the ring." I felt my face flush with embarrassment at being caught staring. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He waved away my apology with a gentle smile. "No need. I've gotten used to it over the years." An old widower who still wears his wedding ring 14 years after his wife died. It tends to catch attention. 14 years. The number hung in the air between us like a question mark. Most people I knew who had lost spouses had moved on by that point, if not to new relationships then at least to removing the symbol of the old one. But here was this man, well into what I guessed was his 8th decade, still wearing his ring as if the marriage were ongoing. "She must have been very special," I offered, the kind of polite observation one makes to acknowledge someone's loss without prying too deeply. The old man's expression shifted, not exactly sadness, but something more complex. A mixture of pain and peace that seemed contradictory yet somehow perfectly balanced. "Margaret was extraordinary," he said simply, though I didn't fully understand just how extraordinary until after she was gone. There was something in the way he said it that made me want to know more, but I hesitated, not wanting to intrude on private grief. The old man seemed to sense my curiosity and my reluctance simultaneously. "Do you have someone waiting for surgery?" he asked, redirecting the conversation with practiced grace. "My sister. Gallbladder. Should be out in another hour or so." He nodded knowingly. "I'm here for my neighbor, Mrs. Chin. Hip replacement. She's 91 years old and tougher than anyone I've ever met. Her family lives in California, so I promised I'd be here when she wakes up. We look after each other in our building." There was something touching about that. This elderly man sitting in a hospital waiting room at nearly 9 o'clock at night for a neighbor. It spoke to a kind of devotion to community, to human connection, that seemed increasingly rare. "That's very kind of you," I said. "It's what people should do for each other," he replied with a slight shrug. "Besides, I don't have much else to occupy my evenings. Haven't for a long time now." The statement hung there, heavy with implication. I found myself leaning slightly forward, drawn into whatever story was beginning to unfold. "May I ask you something personal?" the old man said suddenly. "You look to be in your mid-30s if I'm any judge. Married? Partnered?" "Divorced," I admitted. 2 years now. It was amicable, I suppose. We just wanted different things." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "And since then? Have you dated? Tried to find someone new?" The question was surprisingly direct, but there was no judgment in his tone, only genuine curiosity. "A few times," I said. "Nothing serious. I'm not sure I'm ready for something serious yet." "Because you're still healing from the divorce?" "Maybe," I said carefully. "Or maybe I'm just tired. Tired of trying to make connections that don't quite fit, tired of first dates and getting to know you conversations, tired of pretending to be more interested than I actually am." The old man's eyes lit up with recognition. "That's good," he said firmly. "That tiredness, that's wisdom speaking. That's your authentic self telling you something important." I wasn't sure what to make of that response. "You think being tired of dating is good?" "I think being honest about what you actually want instead of what you think you should want is one of the most important skills a person can develop," he replied. "Most people never manage it. They spend their entire lives pursuing things they don't actually desire because they've been told those things will make them happy." There was a weight to his words that suggested he wasn't just philosophizing but speaking from hard-won experience. I found myself wanting to know more about this man, about the wife whose memory he still honored after 14 years, about whatever wisdom he'd earned through his long life. "Can I tell you something?" the old man said, leaning forward slightly. "Something that might sound strange at first, but I promise there's a point to it." "Of course." "My name is Arthur Pemberton. I'm 76 years old. I was married to Margaret Rose Pemberton for 43 years before she died of ovarian cancer in 2010. And in the 14 years since her death, I have never once gone on a date, never pursued another relationship, never seriously considered remarrying. Not because I couldn't, and not because I was afraid, but because I made a very specific choice. And that choice, the reasoning behind it, it's not what most people would expect. He paused, studying my face carefully. You seem like someone who pays attention to people, who listens to their stories. Am I right about that? I nodded, completely absorbed now. Good, Arthur said, because I'm going to tell you why I never remarried after Margaret died. And more importantly, I'm going to tell you why that decision, which most people think is sad or unhealthy or evidence of being stuck in grief, is actually the most intentional, healthy, and ultimately wisest choice I've ever made. But to understand that, you need to hear the whole story. From the beginning. He glanced at the wall clock. We both have at least an hour to kill. Do you have time to hear an old man's story? I had nothing but time. And somehow, I knew that whatever Arthur Pemberton was about to share would be worth every minute. I have time, I said. Arthur settled back in his chair, his hand moving once again to that worn gold ring, and began. I need to start by telling you about the man I was before I met Margaret, Arthur said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had told this story before, perhaps to himself, working through the memories until they formed a coherent narrative. Because understanding who I was helps explain why losing her was so devastating, and why my choice afterward makes sense. He folded his hands in his lap, the wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. I was born in 1948 in a small town in upstate New York. My father worked in a factory, my mother was a schoolteacher, and we were solidly middle class in the way that term actually meant something back then. Not wealthy, but comfortable. Safe. Arthur's expression grew distant as he reached back across the decades. I was a shy kid. Bookish. Terrible at sports, which in the 1950s made you something of a social outcast among other boys. I spent most of my childhood reading science fiction, mostly adventure stories where awkward young men became heroes through intelligence rather than physical prowess. He smiled slightly at the memory. By the time I got to college, I went to SUNY Albany on a partial scholarship. I developed a protective shell. I was polite but distant, friendly but never too close. I'd learned that keeping people at arm's length meant you never got hurt when they inevitably disappointed you or drifted away. That sounds lonely, I observed. It was, Arthur agreed readily. Profoundly lonely. But I'd convinced myself it was safer than the alternative. I dated occasionally in college, nothing serious. Had a few friends I'd have dinner with or study with, but no one I'd really call close. I was living life at a remove, always slightly disconnected from whatever was happening around me. He paused, his hand moving again to the ring. And then, in my senior year, I met Margaret Collins. The way Arthur said her name, with such tenderness even after all these years, told me immediately that this was where his real story began. It was spring semester, 1969. The world was going crazy, Vietnam protests, civil rights marches, cultural revolution everywhere you looked. And there I was, a 20-year-old political science major who had somehow managed to avoid getting swept up in any of it, still living in my protective bubble. Arthur's smile grew wider at the memory. I was in the library, of course I was in the library, researching a paper on municipal government, which tells you exactly how exciting I was as a young man. And I needed a specific book that someone had already checked out to their corral. I asked the librarian who had it, and she directed me to the 4th floor, East Wing, Corral 23. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with the memory. Margaret was sitting in that corral, surrounded by at least 20 books, frantically taking notes. She had brown hair that she tried to pin back but was escaping in all directions, glasses that kept sliding down her nose, and she was talking to herself, actually debating out loud about something she was reading. "What did you do?" I stood there like an idiot for probably 2 full minutes before she noticed me, Arthur admitted with a laugh. When she finally looked up, I stammered something about needing the book on municipal charter reform, and she looked at me with these incredibly sharp green eyes and said, "You're writing the Hensley paper, aren't you? On post-war urban governance." Arthur shook his head at the memory. I confirmed that I was, and she immediately launched into this passionate critique of Professor Hensley's entire premise, arguing that he completely misunderstood the role of citizen participation in municipal decision-making. She was brilliant, intense, and absolutely fearless in her opinions. "Did she give you the book?" "Eventually," Arthur said. But first we argued about municipal governance for almost an hour. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely alive during a conversation. Not just going through polite motions, but genuinely engaged, challenged, excited by the exchange of ideas. He was quiet for a moment, lost in the memory. When I finally left with the book, I realized I'd forgotten to ask her name. Spent the next 3 days tracking her down. She was a history major, also a senior, and apparently had a reputation among faculty for being one of the most intellectually fierce students they taught. How did you reconnect? I went back to Corel 23 every day for a week until I finally caught her there again, Arthur said. This time I came prepared with my own arguments about citizen participation in governance, and we ended up debating for 3 hours. When the library closed, we kept talking outside, and then at a coffee shop, and then while walking around campus until 2 in the morning. Arthur's expression held both joy and sadness. I learned more about Margaret in that one night than I'd learned about anyone in my entire life. She was from a working-class Irish Catholic family in Boston, first in her family to go to college. She was passionate about social justice and believed deeply that the government had a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable citizens. She wanted to be a teacher, specifically to work with underprivileged kids. She was opinionated, stubborn, idealistic, and absolutely terrifying to someone like me who had spent his whole life playing it safe. But you fell in love with her, I said. Completely, Arthur confirmed. Instantly and completely. Within 2 weeks, I knew I wanted to marry her. Within a month, I'd told her so. Within 2 months, she'd said yes. He paused, and I could see something shifting in his expression. The joy of remembering tempered by the knowledge of how the story would eventually end. We got married 3 months after we graduated, in July 1969. Tiny ceremony, just immediate family. We were both broke. I'd gotten accepted to graduate school but wouldn't start until September. Margaret had a job lined up teaching middle school history in Albany. We moved into a studio apartment that was barely big enough for a bed and a kitchenette. Arthur's voice grew soft with affection. Those first years were hard financially but perfect in every other way. We'd both come from families where marriage meant clearly defined roles. Husband works, wife maintains the home. But Margaret and I created something different. We were partners. Equal partners in everything. That was probably unusual for the time, I observed. Very unusual, Arthur agreed. Especially in the circles we moved in. When Margaret kept teaching after we got married instead of staying home, our families were confused. When she kept teaching even after I finished my master's and got a decent job, I worked for the state government in policy analysis, people assumed we were having fertility problems. Were you? Arthur shook his head. We decided not to have children. It was a mutual decision, made consciously and intentionally. Margaret loved teaching other people's children but had no desire to raise her own. And I'd never felt that pull toward fatherhood. We wanted to build a life that was about us. Our partnership, our shared interests, our contribution to the world through our work. He smiled slightly. This made us odd in the 1970s. Everyone was supposed to want children. When we explained our choice, people would nod politely, but you could see they thought we were selfish or damaged or would change our minds eventually. But we never did. Did you regret it? Never, Arthur said firmly. Not for a single moment. Because choosing not to have children meant we could focus entirely on each other, on building the deepest possible partnership. And that partnership, that's what I'm trying to help you understand. Because you can't understand why I never remarried without understanding what Margaret and I built together. He shifted in his chair, getting comfortable as he prepared to explain. Margaret wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my intellectual equal, my constant companion, my greatest advocate, my most honest critic. We spent almost every waking moment together when we weren't at work, and even then we'd call each other during the day just to share random thoughts. Arthur's expression became almost reverent. We had rituals. Every morning, we'd have coffee together on our tiny balcony. Even in winter, we'd bundle up and sit outside for those 15 minutes. Sunday mornings, we'd go to this used bookstore on Lark Street and each pick out a book for the other person. Wednesday nights were for cooking elaborate meals together, even if they turned out terribly. Friday evenings, we'd go to whatever cultural event Albany was offering: plays, lectures, concerts, art exhibitions. He paused, and I could see him turning over memories like precious stones. But it was the small things that defined us. Margaret knew I needed 30 minutes of silence in the morning before I could handle conversation. I knew she processed stress by cleaning, so when I came home to a spotless apartment, I'd know she'd had a difficult day and needed space to talk through it. She knew I was most creative late at night, so she'd stay up reading beside me while I worked on policy papers. I knew she needed physical affection, just holding hands or sitting close, the way other people need oxygen. "You knew each other completely," I said, feeling something stir in my chest. Recognition, maybe, or longing for that kind of connection. "We did," Arthur confirmed. After 10 years of marriage, we could communicate entire conversations with just a look. After 20 years, I could predict her reactions so accurately that she'd joke I knew her better than she knew herself. After 30 years, we'd built this private universe that only we inhabited. Inside jokes, shared references, ways of being together that would have been invisible to anyone else but were everything to us. Arthur's voice grew quieter. People talk about becoming one flesh in marriage, and everyone assumes that's just poetic religious language. But Margaret and I actually experienced something like that. Not that we lost our individual identities, we were still very much ourselves. But we'd become so intertwined, so deeply integrated into each other's daily existence, that the thought of being without her was like the thought of being without part of myself. He was quiet for a long moment, and I waited, sensing we were approaching something crucial. "In 2007, Margaret started having stomach problems," Arthur said, his voice now carrying the weight of remembered trauma. "She'd always had a sensitive digestive system, so we didn't think much of it at first. But when the problems persisted and got worse, she finally saw a doctor." Arthur's hand gripped the armrest of his chair. "Ovarian cancer. Stage 3 by the time they found it. The doctor said if she'd come in 6 months earlier, the prognosis would have been much better. But Margaret being Margaret, she'd convinced herself it was nothing serious, had toughed it out, and hadn't wanted to worry me. "I'm so sorry," I said, the inadequate words all I could offer. "She started treatment immediately," Arthur continued. "Aggressive chemotherapy, surgery, everything they could throw at it. And for a year it looked like it was working. The cancer went into remission, and we dared to hope we'd beaten it." His voice cracked slightly. "Then it came back. Metastasized. The doctors said there were more treatments they could try, but the cancer was too aggressive. Maybe 6 months, they said. Maybe a year if we were lucky." Arthur took a slow breath, composing himself. "We had 8 months. 8 months from the moment they told us it was terminal to the moment she died. And those 8 months, they were the most painful and the most precious time of my entire life." I felt my own eyes beginning to sting with tears, and Arthur's story was far from over. Margaret handled her dying with the same fierce intelligence she'd brought to everything else, Arthur said. "She wanted to die at home, in our apartment, surrounded by our books and our memories and our life together. So we converted our living room into a hospice space, and I became her full-time caregiver." He looked directly at me. "Do you know what it's like to watch the person you love most in the world slowly disappear? Not all at once, but piece by piece, day by day, while you're helpless to stop it." I shook my head, unable to speak. "It's a special kind of torture," Arthur said quietly. "Every day she was a little weaker, in a little more pain, a little further from the person she'd been. And every day, I had to witness it, had to help her with increasingly basic functions, and watch her dignity stripped away by disease." His voice was barely above a whisper now. "But here's what most people don't understand about that kind of caregiving. It wasn't just pain. It was also love in its purest form. Every time I helped her to the bathroom, every meal I prepared that she could barely eat, every hour I spent just sitting beside her holding her hand, it was love. Active love. Love as a verb, not noun." Arthur's eyes were wet now, but he continued. "About 2 months before she died, Margaret did something that confused me at the time but makes perfect sense now. She started giving me instructions. Not about practical matters, We'd already handled all the legal and financial arrangements. These were different kinds of instructions. Instructions about how to live after she is gone. What kind of instructions? She told me she didn't want me to make any major life decisions for at least 2 years after her death, Arthur said. No moving, no career changes, no dramatic shifts. She said I'd need time to understand who I was as an individual again, after decades of being half of a partnership. He paused. She told me to keep our routines, at least the ones I could keep without her. I still have coffee on the balcony every morning. I still go to the bookstore on Sundays. Still cook elaborate meals on Wednesday nights, even if I was cooking for one. She said those rituals would keep me anchored when grief tried to pull me under. Arthur's expression grew more intense. And then she told me something that I didn't fully understand until years later. She said, "Arthur, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't make any decisions about relationships, about dating or remarrying, based on what you think I would want or what you think would honor my memory. Those decisions have to be about you. About what you actually need and want, not what you think you should need or want." That's a remarkable thing to say, I observed. It was, Arthur agreed. Most dying spouses either tell their partners to move on and find happiness again, or they extract promises that the partner will never love anyone else. Margaret refused to do either. She said my life after her death was mine to live, and she trusted me to live it authentically. He was quiet for a moment. 3 days before she died, Margaret had one of those moments of unusual clarity that sometimes happens near the end. The morphine fog lifted, and she was more herself than she'd been in weeks. We talked for hours that day, about our life together, about all the adventures we'd had, about how grateful we both were for what we'd built. Arthur's voice broke. And she said, "Arthur, I want you to know something. If there's an afterlife and I'm there, I won't be watching you, judging your choices, or waiting for you to join me. I'll be at peace, complete whole. And whatever life you build after I'm gone, whether it includes someone new or whether you choose to be alone, that life is yours. Not mine. Not ours. Yours. Don't let my death define the rest of your living." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I made no attempt to hide them. Arthur's own eyes were wet, but he pushed forward with his story. She died on a Thursday morning in June, just as the sun was coming up. I was holding her hand, reading aloud from her favorite book, Pride and Prejudice, which she'd read probably 50 times over our marriage. She took a breath, then didn't take another one. Just like that, after 43 years together, she was gone. The waiting room had grown quiet around us. Other people were present, but they seemed far away, as if Arthur and I existed in our own bubble of shared story and grief. "What did you do?" I asked softly. "I sat with her for a long time," Arthur said. "Maybe an hour. Just holding her hand, looking at her face, trying to memorize every detail because I knew this was the last time I'd see her physical presence. Then I called the hospice, and they sent someone to help with the arrangements. And then began the longest, darkest period of my life." Arthur shifted in his chair, pulling his cardigan tighter around himself. "The first year after Margaret died was exactly as terrible as you'd imagine. Maybe worse. The grief was physical, actual pain in my chest, exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, a constant nausea from the wrongness of being alive while she wasn't." He looked down at his hands. I followed Margaret's instructions about keeping our routines, but it was torture. Having coffee alone on the balcony every morning, seeing the empty chair where she should have been, going to the bookstore on Sundays and automatically reaching for books she'd love before remembering she wasn't there to read them. Cooking elaborate meals on Wednesday nights and then eating alone, or more often, throwing the food away because I couldn't bear to eat what I'd made for both of us. "That sounds unbearable," I said. "It was," Arthur agreed. "But here's what I discovered in that first year. Grief has its own wisdom if you're willing to listen to it. All that pain, all that missing her, it wasn't just suffering. It was information. It was my psyche telling me how profound the connection had been, how deeply she'd been integrated into my sense of self, how much my entire identity had been built around being her partner." He paused thoughtfully. "About 8 months in, people started suggesting I might want to start dating again. My sister, some well-meaning friends, even my therapist gently broached the subject. They'd say things like, "You're still young," "I was 62, or "Margaret would want you to be happy," or "You shouldn't spend the rest of your life alone." How did you respond? At first, I didn't respond at all, Arthur said. I just shut down the conversation and changed the subject. But the suggestions kept coming, and eventually I had to confront the question directly. Did I want to date again? Did I want to pursue another relationship? Could I even imagine being with someone who wasn't Margaret? Arthur's expression grew thoughtful. So I did what Margaret and I had always done when facing important questions. I examined it carefully, honestly, without letting social expectations or conventional wisdom cloud my thinking. And here's what I discovered. The thought of dating made me feel absolutely nothing. Not fear, not excitement, not curiosity, just complete indifference. Because you weren't ready yet? That's what everyone assumed, Arthur said. But I kept examining that indifference, kept asking myself what it meant. And gradually, I came to understand something crucial. I wasn't indifferent because I was still grieving too much to think about relationships. I was indifferent because I had absolutely no desire for another romantic relationship. Not then, not ever. He leaned forward slightly. And once I recognized that, I had to ask myself why. Was I afraid of being hurt again? Was I trying to preserve Margaret's memory by refusing to let anyone else in? Was I stuck in some unhealthy pattern of mourning? What did you conclude? Arthur's voice became more animated. I concluded that none of those things were true. I wasn't afraid of new love, I just didn't want it. I wasn't trying to preserve Margaret's memory. Her memory was already preserved in who I'd become during our marriage. I wasn't stuck in grief. I was making a conscious, intentional choice based on a clear understanding of what I actually valued. He settled back, his hand returning to the ring. Here's what I realized. Margaret and I had built something extraordinary. A partnership so deep, so complete, so profoundly satisfying that it had filled every need I had for romantic love. For 43 years, I'd experienced what most people spend their lives searching for and never quite finding. Arthur looked directly at me. So why would I want to try to recreate that with someone else? Why would I want to start over, doing the work of getting to know someone new, building trust and intimacy from scratch, compromising and negotiating all the little things that make two people compatible? I'd already done that work. I'd already found my person. And the fact that she was dead didn't change the fundamental completeness of what we'd created. I felt something shifting in my understanding. You're saying you didn't remarry because you'd already had the relationship you needed? Exactly, Arthur said with emphasis. Most people who lose spouses and then remarry, they're seeking to fill a void, to replace what they lost. But I didn't feel empty. I felt complete. Margaret and I had given each other everything we needed for those 43 years. Why would I need more? He paused, letting that sink in. Think about it this way. Imagine you spend your entire career building a house. Not just any house, but your dream house, perfectly designed to your specifications, filled with everything you need. You live in that house for 43 years, and every day you wake up grateful for it. Then one day the house burns down. Arthur leaned forward. Do you immediately start building another house? Maybe, if you need shelter and have nowhere else to go. But what if you have enough savings to live comfortably in a nice apartment? What if you can meet all your practical needs without building another house? Would you still do it? Would you invest the enormous time and energy and emotional resources required to build another dream house, knowing it could never be quite the same as the one you lost? The metaphor landed heavily. You decided you'd rather live in the apartment than build a new house. Precisely, Arthur said. And that apartment, my life as a widower, it's not sad or empty or less than. It's different from the house I had with Margaret, but it's still a rich, meaningful life. I have friends. I have work that matters to me. I still consult on policy issues. I have a community, like Mrs. Chen and the other people in my building. I have routines and interests and purposes. I have everything I need except a romantic partner, and I genuinely don't want a romantic partner. Arthur's voice grew more passionate. But here's what people struggle to understand. I'm not making this choice out of inability or fear or pathology. I'm making it out of profound respect for what Margaret and I created together. Our marriage was complete. It was whole. It was perfect in its imperfection. And trying to recreate that with someone else would feel like saying what we had wasn't enough, that I need to top it up with a sequel. But Margaret told you not to make decisions based on honoring her memory, I pointed out. She did, Arthur agreed. And I'm not. This decision isn't about Margaret. It's about me. It's about recognizing that I'm one of those people who loves deeply, once, with everything they have. I'm not a serial monogamist. I'm not someone who falls in love easily or often. I found my person, I had my great love, and I'm content with that. I don't need another one. He smiled slightly. You know what's interesting? If Margaret had died when I was 40, or even 50, I might have eventually remarried. Not because I'm a different person fundamentally, but because I might not have had the self-knowledge yet to recognize what I'm telling you now. It took age, experience, and the clarity that sometimes comes with loss to understand this about myself. Arthur glanced at the clock on the wall. We're getting close to when our loved ones should be out of surgery. But there's more I need to tell you, because understanding why I didn't remarry is only half the story. The other half is about what happened 5 years ago that confirmed I'd made the right choice. I leaned forward, completely absorbed. Arthur had been talking for almost an hour, but I could have listened for 3 more. 5 years after Margaret died, I was settled into my life as a widower, Arthur continued. I'd moved through the worst of the grief, had found my routines, had built a satisfying life that honored what I'd had while being fully present to what I currently had. I was genuinely content, not deliriously happy every day, but deeply at peace with my choices and my circumstances. He paused. And then I met Patricia Henderson. Something in the way he said the name made me pay even closer attention. Patricia was a widow herself, who had lost her husband about 3 years earlier. She started attending the same community center where I volunteered teaching citizenship classes to immigrants. She was smart, articulate, and shared many of my interests. We struck up a friendship, coffee after volunteer sessions, occasionally going to cultural events together, that kind of thing. Arthur's expression grew more complex. And Patricia made it clear, after a few months, that she was interested in more than friendship. She never pressured me, never made me uncomfortable, but the interest was there. And I had to seriously examine whether this might be the universe offering me a second chance at partnership. What did you decide? I spent about 3 months genuinely considering it, Arthur said. I liked Patricia. I enjoyed her company. Could imagine, in abstract terms, what a relationship with her might look like. And part of me thought maybe this was what I was supposed to do, that fate had brought Patricia into my life because I was meant to open myself to new love. He shook his head slowly. But every time I tried to imagine actually being in a romantic relationship with Patricia, I felt this resistance. Not fear, not guilt about Margaret, just this clear internal no. And I kept examining that no, trying to understand if it was coming from a healthy place or an unhealthy one. What did you conclude? I concluded that I was genuinely, authentically not interested in a romantic relationship with Patricia or anyone else, Arthur said firmly. Not because Patricia wasn't wonderful, she was. Not because I was stuck in grief or afraid of moving on, I wasn't. But because I'd had my fill of romantic love. I'd had 43 years of the most profound partnership I could imagine, and I didn't want to dilute that experience by trying to create a pale echo of it with someone else. Arthur's voice grew gentler. So I had a conversation with Patricia. A very honest conversation where I explained that I valued our friendship but couldn't offer her anything romantic. That I'd made a conscious decision not to pursue romantic relationships, not because of her but because of my own needs and choices. How did she respond? She was disappointed, naturally, Arthur said. But she respected it. She asked if I was sure, if I might change my mind with more time. I told her I was certain, and that if she needed to end our friendship because staying friends would be painful, I'd understand completely. He smiled slightly. Patricia thought about it for a few weeks, then came back and said she'd like to continue the friendship if I was comfortable with that. And we did for about a year. But eventually she met someone else, someone who was looking for a romantic relationship, and they got married. We're still friendly, see each other occasionally at community events, but we're not close anymore. Arthur paused thoughtfully. And here's what that experience taught me: I'd made the right choice. Because watching Patricia fall in love with someone else, I felt no regret, no jealousy, no sense of having missed an opportunity. I felt happy for her, genuinely happy that she'd found what she was looking for. And that confirmed that I hadn't rejected a relationship with Patricia because I was damaged or stuck. I'd rejected it because I genuinely didn't want what she was offering. That must have been clarifying, I observed. It was, Arthur agreed. After Patricia, I stopped second-guessing my choice. Stopped wondering if maybe I should try dating, if maybe I was missing out on something. I knew with certainty that I'd found my path, and that path didn't include romantic partnership. He looked at me intently. But here's where the story gets really interesting. About 3 years ago, I had an experience that made me realize my choice wasn't just valid, it was protective. Protective how? Arthur's expression grew serious. I need to tell you about a letter. A letter Margaret wrote before she died, but that I didn't receive until 9 years after her death. I felt my breath catch. How is that possible? Margaret had given the letter to her best friend, Diane, with instructions not to give it to me until at least 5 years after her death, and only if Diane thought I needed to read it, Arthur explained. Diane held on to it for 9 years, watching me build my life as a widower, and finally decided the time was right. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed slightly with age. He didn't open it, just held it carefully in his hands. "Should I tell you what was in this letter?" he asked. "Please," I said, completely absorbed. Arthur took a slow breath. Margaret wrote that she needed to tell me something she'd never mentioned while she was alive, something she'd discovered about 6 months before her cancer diagnosis. She'd run into someone, a woman I'd briefly dated in college before meeting Margaret. This woman, Janet, had apparently spent decades thinking about me, wondering what might have been, building up a fantasy of what our life together could have looked like. He opened the envelope carefully, pulling out several pages of Margaret's handwriting. Janet had approached Margaret at an alumni event, not knowing who Margaret was at first. And in that conversation, Janet had revealed an obsessive fixation on me, asking detailed questions about our life, making comments that suggested she'd been following my career, expressing opinions about what mistakes I'd made in my life choices. Arthur's voice grew quieter. Margaret wrote that she'd been deeply unsettled by this encounter but hadn't told me because she didn't want to worry me or make me paranoid. But she'd made Diane promise that if Janet ever approached me after Margaret's death, which Margaret suspected she might, that I should have this letter as context and warning. "Did Janet approach you?" Arthur nodded slowly. About 2 months after I received Margaret's letter, Janet contacted me. Sent me a long email expressing condolences for Margaret's death, 9 years late, and suggesting we reconnect since we were both single now. She framed it as old friends catching up, but the email had undertones that made me uncomfortable. He carefully returned the letter to his pocket. If I hadn't had Margaret's letter, I might have thought I was being paranoid or oversensitive. I might have agreed to coffee out of politeness. But because I knew what Margaret had observed, I could see Janet's approach for what it was, not a genuine offer of friendship but an attempt to insinuate herself into my life now that Margaret was gone. "What did you do?" "I sent a polite but firm email declining any contact," Arthur said. "And Janet didn't take it well. Sent several more emails, increasingly upset, accusing me of being cold, of being stuck in the past, of wasting my life on a dead woman. She even showed up at my building once, which is when I finally had to be blunt and tell her I had no interest in reconnecting and she needed to stop contacting me." Arthur's expression was both sad and grateful. Margaret's letter protected me. Not because I would have fallen for Janet, I wouldn't have, but because it helped me recognize an unhealthy situation quickly and respond appropriately, rather than giving someone access to my life out of misplaced guilt or politeness. He looked at me directly. And that's when I understood something important. Margaret's final gift to me wasn't just our 43 years together. It was also teaching me to trust my own judgment about what I needed, to make choices based on my authentic desires rather than external pressure, and to protect the life I'd built even when others thought I should be living differently. She was still taking care of you, I said softly. In a way, Arthur agreed. Though really she was teaching me to take care of myself, to trust that I knew what I needed better than anyone else did. He settled back in his chair. So that's why I never remarried. Not because I was afraid, not because I was stuck in grief, not because I couldn't imagine loving someone else, but because I'd had the love of my life, and that was enough. Because I'm genuinely content with the life I've built as a widower. Because I trust myself to know what I need, and what I need isn't another romantic relationship. Arthur looked down at his wedding ring, turning it gently with his thumb. I still wear this ring because I'm still married to Margaret, in every way that matters to me. Not legally, obviously, but emotionally, spiritually, in terms of how I understand myself, I'm still her partner. Death separated us physically, but it didn't end the marriage in my heart. That's beautiful, I said, meaning it. It's not beautiful or sad or any other judgment, Arthur said gently. It's just what's true for me. Some people need to remarry after loss. Some people heal by finding new love. That's completely valid, and I'd never suggest my path is right for everyone. But my path is right for me, and I need to learn to trust that without apologizing for it. He glanced at the clock again. Our loved ones should be out any moment now. But before we go our separate ways, I want to ask you something. Of course. You said you're tired of dating, tired of trying to make connections that don't quite fit. What if that tiredness is actually clarity? What if you're discovering that you don't actually want what you've been told you should want? The question landed with surprising force. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe. I'm not suggesting you should never date again or never remarry, Arthur clarified. I'm suggesting you give yourself permission to be genuinely honest about what you actually want, rather than what society expects. Maybe you do want a partner eventually, but not right now. Maybe you want companionship but not romance. Maybe you want something in between. All of those options are valid if they're what you authentically want. He smiled. Margaret taught me that the only tragedy is living a life that isn't yours. Living based on others' expectations, others' timelines, others' definitions of what a good life looks like. Whether you remarry or stay single or find some third option no one's thought of yet, it's all valid if it's authentically chosen. Before I could respond, a nurse appeared at the entrance to the waiting room. Family for Emma Crawford? I stood up quickly. That's me. The nurse smiled. She's out of surgery and doing great. You can see her in about 15 minutes once she's settled in recovery. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. When I turned back to Arthur, he was standing as well, preparing to find out about his neighbor. But before either of us could move toward the nurse's station, I felt compelled to say something. Arthur, thank you. For sharing your story, for being so honest, I don't even know how to describe what this conversation has meant. He smiled warmly. Thank you for listening. Most people don't, you know. They hear, I never remarried, and immediately start trying to fix what they perceive as a problem. You just listened and tried to understand. That's a rare gift. We stood there for a moment in the fluorescent-lit waiting room, two strangers who had shared something profound. Can I tell you one more thing? Arthur asked. Please. The greatest lesson Margaret taught me, through our marriage and through her death, is that love doesn't require presence to be real. I love Margaret as much now as I did when she was alive. Maybe more, because now I understand how rare what we had was. And that love doesn't make me sad or stuck. It makes me grateful every single day that I got to experience it. Arthur reached out and shook my hand firmly. Whatever you decide about your own life, dating or not dating, remarrying or staying single, I hope you'll trust yourself enough to choose authentically. The world needs more people who are brave enough to live the lives they actually want rather than the lives they've been told to want. With that, Arthur walked toward the nurse's station to inquire about Mrs. Chen, and I made my way to find Emma in recovery. But as I walked through those sterile hospital corridors, I found myself thinking about everything Arthur had shared. His love for Margaret, so profound that it didn't require her physical presence to continue. His courage to choose a path that others couldn't understand. His clarity about his own needs and desires, even when they didn't match social expectations. His peace with a choice that many would perceive as sad or limiting. And I thought about my own life. The divorce I'd framed as a failure that needed to be overcome by finding someone new. The exhaustion I'd been feeling about dating that I'd interpreted as something wrong with me. The vague sense that I should want to be in a relationship, even though I'd been perfectly content on my own for 2 years. What if Arthur was right? What if that exhaustion was actually wisdom? What if I was discovering something important about myself, that maybe I didn't actually want what I'd been told I should want? I found Emma in her recovery room, groggy but smiling. As I sat beside her bed holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness, I kept returning to Arthur's words. The only tragedy is living a life that isn't yours. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's story. It had lodged itself in my consciousness, challenging assumptions I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. I found myself paying more attention to my actual desires rather than my socialized beliefs about what I should desire. And I made a realization that surprised me. I was genuinely happy being single. Not making the best of it until someone better came along, happy. Actually, authentically content with my life exactly as it was. I had good friends, meaningful work, interests and hobbies that fulfilled me, a sense of purpose and direction. What exactly was missing? The answer I discovered was nothing. Nothing was missing. I'd been operating under the assumption that being single was a temporary state to be resolved through finding a partner, but what if it wasn't? What if, like Arthur, I'd reached a point in my life where romantic partnership wasn't what I needed or wanted? This realization was both liberating and lonely. Liberating because it meant I could stop the exhausting work of trying to manufacture romantic interest I didn't actually feel. Lonely because I knew most people wouldn't understand, would see my choice as sad or defensive or evidence of being damaged by my divorce. But Arthur had understood. And knowing that someone else had walked this path before me, had chosen differently than society expected and had built a rich, meaningful life anyway, that gave me courage. 3 months after meeting Arthur in that hospital waiting room, I made a decision. I deleted my dating apps, not with any drama or announcement, just quietly removed them from my phone. I stopped accepting blind date setups from well-meaning friends. I stopped treating my singleness as a problem to be solved. And something remarkable happened. I became more peaceful than I'd been in years. The low-level anxiety that had been humming in the background of my life, the sense that I should be doing more, trying harder, being more open to romance, it simply disappeared. I was living my life, not the life I'd been told I should want. And that made all the difference. I never saw Arthur again. I thought about returning to the hospital, maybe on a Tuesday evening, to see if I could find him and thank him properly for the gift he'd given me. But somehow it felt right to let that one conversation stand on its own. A perfect, complete encounter that had changed my life without requiring any follow-up. But his story stayed with me. His courage to choose authentically. His clarity about his own needs. His peace with a decision others couldn't understand. His profound love for Margaret that didn't require her presence to be real. And his final lesson, that the greatest act of love, for ourselves and for others, is to trust ourselves enough to live the lives we actually want, not the lives we've been told to want. 6 months after meeting Arthur, I was at a coffee shop working on my laptop when I overheard a conversation at the next table. A woman was crying, telling her friend about her divorce 2 years ago and how she felt broken because she still hadn't met anyone new, still didn't feel ready to date, still couldn't imagine opening herself up to love again. Her friend was offering the standard advice: you need to get back out there. It's been 2 years, that's long enough to grieve. You'll never meet anyone if you don't try. And the divorced woman was nodding, accepting these statements as truth, believing there was something wrong with her because she didn't want what everyone said she should want. I almost didn't intervene. It wasn't my place, it was none of my business, and I barely knew how to articulate what Arthur had taught me. But then I thought about that moment in the hospital when Arthur had chosen to share his story with a stranger, and I understood why he'd done it. So I did something I never would have done before. I turned to their table and said, "I'm sorry for eavesdropping, but I overheard what you're going through, and I wonder if you'd let me tell you about someone I met who taught me something important about love and loss and the courage to choose your own path." The woman looked surprised but nodded. Her friend looked skeptical but curious. And I told them Arthur's story, not with his eloquence or his depth of experience, but as faithfully as I could. About a man who loved so completely that he needed nothing after his wife died. About the courage it takes to choose differently than society expects. About the possibility that healing doesn't always mean moving on. When I finished, the divorced woman was crying again, but these were different tears. "I thought something was wrong with me," she whispered. "I thought I was broken because I don't want to date again. But maybe I'm not broken. Maybe I just don't want what everyone says I should want." "Maybe," I agreed. "And maybe that's okay." I left the coffee shop that day understanding why Arthur had shared his story with me. Not to convince me of anything, not to prescribe a particular path, but to offer an alternative possibility. To say, there are many ways to love, many ways to grieve, many ways to build a meaningful life. Your way doesn't have to match anyone else's to be valid. That's what I'm trying to do now, sharing Arthur's story with you. I'm not suggesting you should never remarry after loss. I'm not saying being single is superior to partnership. I'm not prescribing any particular path. I'm simply offering Arthur's story as evidence that there are more possibilities than we're usually shown. That sometimes the most radical act is trusting yourself enough to choose what you actually need rather than what you've been told to need. That love can continue long after presence ends. That wholeness can exist with or without a partner. Arthur is probably still out there somewhere, wearing his wedding ring, visiting Mrs. Chen and his other neighbors, living his quiet, intentional life. Still married to Margaret in all the ways that matter to him. Still at peace with a choice most people will never understand. And somewhere, there might be someone like you, wondering if it's okay to choose differently than expected. Wondering if wholeness requires a partner or can exist alone. Wondering if it's possible to honor great love by not trying to replace it. Arthur's answer would be yes. It's not just possible, it's sometimes the truest, most authentic choice you can make. The only tragedy is living a life that isn't yours. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the 11th Hour Tales for more eye-opening tales every day.